Welcome and good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Cartman, the Director of Religious Education here at Emerson Unitarian Universalist Church in Houston, Texas. Our beloved community of faith, reason, and affection welcomes all to grow in mind and spirit as together we build a better world. If you are joining us for the first time this morning, we extend a special welcome and invite you to stay after the service for conversations with a smaller group of Emersonians. Today, John Pepper leads worship, with support from me and our music director, Adrian Rodriguez, as well as Pat Smith, helping out with the reading. The Reverend John Pepper is a member of the Unitarian Fellowship of Houston and is recently retired from 39 years in the oil and gas industry. He received his MDiv here in Houston at the Houston Graduate School of Theology and was ordained by Thoreau Woods UU Church in Huntsville in 2010. John is loving retirement. You'll notice that we've muted you. This helps all of us to hear the service better, and we encourage you to use the chat box. Following the worship service, we'll have coffee hour time, a chance for you to gather in smaller groups to discuss the service and what's going on in your lives. Adrian?
Whoever you are, wherever you come from, wherever you find yourself on life's journey, whichever your pronouns, whether you've walked in or rolled in or dialed in, whomever you love, you are welcome here.
Our opening words this morning were written by Marta Flanagan. She says, "In this time, we turn our thoughts to how we can touch and be touched, love and be loved, forgive and be forgiven, heal and be healed, so that the goodness of our lives is a shared blessing."
Every Sunday, Unitarian Universalists across the country and around the world light a chalice as a symbol of our faith. If you have a chalice at home or perhaps a candle, we encourage you to grab it now and light it as I share the chalice lighting. May the flame here lit be to us a symbol of the torch that is passed from hand to hand and life to life, of caring and concern and the passion for involvement which have marked the men and women of our liberal faith for many generations. And now if you'll join us in singing our opening hymn, Gather the Spirit. I don't know what that is. Oh, here it is.
Gather the Spirit. chorus of life resounding as one. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then, gather in hope, compassion and strength, gather to celebrate once again.
Our story today is Whoever You Are by Mem Fox, illustrated by Leslie Staub. Little one, whoever you are, wherever you are, there are little ones just like you all over the world. Their skin may be different from yours, and their homes may be different from yours. Their schools may be different from yours, and their lands may be different from yours. Their lives may be different from yours, and their words may be very different from yours. But inside their hearts are just like yours, whoever they are, wherever they are, all over the world. Their smiles are like yours, and they laugh just like you. Their hurts are like yours, and they cry like you too. Whoever they are, wherever they are, all over the world. Little one, when you are older and when you are grown, you may be different. And they may be different, wherever you are, wherever they are, in this big wide world. But remember this: joys are the same, and love is the same. Pain is the same, and blood is the same. Smiles are the same, and hearts are just the same. Wherever they are, wherever you are, wherever we are, all over the world.
Our responsive reading this morning is number 531, and it was written by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Adrian's going to join with me in the responsive part of this reading. Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells with us, that the sources of nature are in our own minds.
As there is no screen or ceiling between our heads and the infinite heavens, so there is no bar or wall in the soul where we, the effect, cease, and God, the cause, begins.
I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine.
There is deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is accessible to us.
Every moment when the individual feels invaded by it is memorable.
It comes to the lowly and simple. It comes to whosoever will put off what is foreign and proud. It comes as insight. It comes as serenity and grandeur.
The soul's health consists in the fullness of its reception.
Forever and ever, the influx of this better and more universal self is new and unsearchable.
Within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one.
When it breaks through our intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through our will, it is virtue. When it flows through our affections, it is love. Giving out of what is our own is a transformative act. As a community of faith, we collect an offering not for ourselves or our congregation, but to give to others as a collective action of our community and as a way to live out our shared values. Please give with a generous heart to support the July Share the Plate recipients, the Women's Home. The Women's Home provides housing assistance, residential treatment, and collaborative community services to prepare women and their families to become empowered and productive forces in their communities. And as always, 25% of your offering will go to Interfaith Ministries Meals on Wheels, feeding Houston's seniors. We have 3 ways to give, but really we have 2 ways to give. We usually have 3 ways to give, but today the web link is not working because our website is under construction. So for today, you can text the number on the screen, or if you prefer to mail a check, we are still checking the mail at church. Thank you for sharing as you were able.
Please close your eyes or center yourself in whatever way works for you as we enter into a time of prayer and reflection. The central theme of today's entire worship service is related to the concept of calling. Young or old, well off or not so well off, able or disabled, we all, from time to time, have an inner urging to do something that simply needs to be done. The still small voice is always active in our lives. As you sit where you are in the quiet, I simply ask that you reflect for a brief time on something simple or grand that your conscience, your soul, that still small voice, or whatever you choose to name it, is calling you to personally do. And I ask that you begin to reflect and consider how might you go about answering that call. Amen and namaste.
Our reading this morning is from the book Leaving Church by Barbara Brown Taylor. Encountering God in other people is saving my life now. I do not look for angels anymore, although I have nothing against them. The clerk at the grocery store is messenger enough for me, at least if I give her a fraction of the attention that I lavish on my interior monologue. To merge from my self-preoccupation long enough to acknowledge her human presence is no mean feat. But when I do, I can almost always discover what she has to teach me. And not only she, but every person who crosses my path. While it is generally more pleasant for me to encounter people who support my view of reality, I am finding that people who see things otherwise tend to do me a lot more good. Like quantum physicists, they remind me that reality is more relations than absolute. Every time I'm pretty sure that I have some absolute truth all worked out, a human being comes along to pose an exception to my rule. Over and over, the human exceptions prove to be more revelatory than the rules. Committing myself to the task of becoming fully human is saving my life now. This is not the same as the job of being human, which came with my birth certificate. To become fully human is something extra, a conscious choice that not everyone makes. Based on my limited wisdom and experience, there is more than one way to do this. If I were a Buddhist, I might do it by taking the Bodhisattva vow. If I were a Jew, I might do it by following Torah. Because I am a Christian, I do it by imitating Christ. Although I will be the first to admit that I want to stop about a day short of following him all the way.
Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In dark and rain, sorrow and pain, still you remain, singing. Calming my fears, quenching my tears, through all the years, singing. Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In dark and rain, sorrow and pain, still you remain, singing. Calming my fears, quenching my tears, through all the years, singing.
I am fascinated by an event that happens twice each year. Each spring and fall, hummingbirds migrate through Houston and East Texas. While we often see a few hummingbirds here in Houston, we saw many more at a weekend lake house we owned outside of Goodrich, Texas. We had several feeders, so the hummingbirds always stopped by for fuel on their remarkable journey in the spring, which takes them all the way from Central America up through the eastern parts of Texas and north to Canada. And of course, a similar return trip in the fall. There seems to be a pull from nature, almost a calling, if you will, that guides them on their long journey both north and south. This pull, this force, whatever it is and however it works, reflects a mysterious and fascinating aspect of nature we simply don't understand. The force that leads them all remains a mystery to the scientific world. Whatever that force is, it provides a powerful impulse to live. When the hummingbirds stop to eat, one solitary individual will usually stake out a claim on an isolated feeder. That bird is then vicious as he or she protects that feeder. However, when several feeders are in the same vicinity and there's more than enough food to go around, it becomes too much work to defend a feeder, and everyone gets a share, and there is much less defensive posturing. In the isolated feeder situation, that individual bird responds to his or her nature in defense of the feeder. Its nature and circumstances dictate how it acts. I have no idea whether or not this impulse to live is the product of a divine being. But whatever force it is, I believe we too are somehow guided by it. And I call it life. And it is our collective calling to live and live fully. We are without a doubt a product of nature. And why would we be any less likely to have similar forces working on or within us? In many respects, we are not that much different from hummingbirds. Nature often dictates how we act as well, more than some of us would like to believe. But there is one big difference. We can choose something different. We can choose to rise above our perceived limitations. We can consciously choose to share or not to fight when our first inclinations might be to do otherwise. We can respond to what some might refer to as a higher calling. This is what our souls, our spirits call us to do. We are called to do something different. But sadly, not everyone listens. About this particular topic, this concept of calling, I have often felt like a rebel related to it in my UU ministerial circles. You see, I don't believe in the traditional concept of calling as claimed by many ministers. A common definition of calling found in the dictionary is a strong inner impulse toward a particular course of action, especially when accompanied by conviction of divine influence. In my opinion, many Western ministers have claimed similar divine callings, and then based on their callings, they have perpetrated far too many abuses for me to ascribe to their callings anything other than ego-driven agendas. It seems to me far too often a calling has been used to establish authority and credentials where none were before. This calling, rightly or wrongly, somehow makes their voices and their opinions heard above others who claim no such divine influence. There's simply little or no evidence to support the concept of a calling as a divine influence, which then turns the endowed individual with some form of unquestionable wisdom or authority, at least not in the numbers who claim to have heard that calling. I shared my concerns regarding the concept of calling with a UUA-approved psychologist hired to do a psychological assessment of me for the UUA. She understood my quandary and suggested I substitute the word passion for the word calling. And that made sense to me. I am passionate about what I'm doing, but I can't simply label it a traditional calling that somehow excludes me from the rest of you. On the other hand, callings or passions are not somehow mystically restricted to the ministerial ranks. I believe we are all called by our consciences, our souls, our spirits, or whatever you choose to call it, to act above our lesser natures. Some just choose to act more aggressively and in different ways than others. A school teacher acting out of a desire to grow young minds. A social worker hoping to provide aid to the poor. A doctor or a nurse attempting to heal the sick. A group of people who maintain a butterfly garden, hoping to help ensure the survival of a species. And even one neighbor who simply helps another neighbor fix a leaky faucet who couldn't otherwise afford a plumber, are all examples of people who have chosen to rise above their lesser natures and help just for the sake of helping. And they are all responses to callings or passions. I strongly believe if we as a denomination are to survive and grow, we will all need to respond to the challenges ahead of us and not leave our collective fates in the hands of those who believe they are somehow different and have some special mission in life, uniquely ordained by some mystical force. Yes, I may be a rebel or even a heretic, but I am not alone. Or at least I believe I know a few famous individuals who might agree with me. Each of these individuals started out on similar ministerial paths. They each received some form of calling, pursued a theology degree, were ordained, and served in churches as ministers. Each eventually left the active ministry. Two pursued religious academic careers, and the third pursued a lecture career. One is still alive and remains very successful, and the other two have long since died. But both of them leave written legacies still used by people every single day. Their callings and their passions went far beyond ministerial assignments, and their contributions would likely have been equally valuable had they skipped over the first two steps in the process and proceeded directly to their ultimate careers. In any event, I don't believe their ultimate callings were in any way limited or diminished by their leaving active ministries, nor do I believe those callings were mystically enhanced by going through the ministry. Further, I can't imagine it is any different for any one of you with your own particular and unique callings. Once again, I believe we are all called, but not everyone listens. You've already heard from the first of my three individuals. Barbara Brown Taylor is currently very active in the Christian community as a professor and an author. I consider her to be on the liberal side of the current Christian faith. She had her calling as a young child when she connected with all living things and the need to protect them as opposed to exploiting them. Later, as a young adult, in her attempt to discern what exactly she was supposed to do with her life, she says she received an answer directly from God. She says, "One midnight, I asked God to tell me as plainly as possible what I was supposed to do. The answer that came into my sleepy head was, anything that pleases you." "What?" she said, waking up. "What kind of an answer is that?" "Do anything that pleases you," the voice in her head said again, "and belong to me." She goes on to say, "That simplified things considerably. I could pump gas in Idaho or dig latrines in Pago Pago, as far as God was concerned, as long as I remembered whose I was. If my own experience can be trusted, then God does not call us once, but many times. There are calls to faith and calls to ordination, but in between, there are calls to particular communities and calls to particular tasks within them, calls into and out of relationship, as well as calls to seek God wherever God may be found. Sometimes those calls ring clear as bells, and sometimes they are barely audible. But in any case, we are not meant to hear them all by ourselves. It was part of God's genius to incorporate us as one body so that our ears have other ears, other eyes, minds, hearts, and voices to help us interpret what we have heard. Together, we can hear our calls, and together we can answer them. If only we will listen for the still, small voice that continues to speak to us in the language of our lives. Her biography describes almost exactly what I'm talking about. Life calls me to something more. This intelligence that we possess and that allows us to imagine and move beyond our perceived limitation calls me to something more. You heard a call to join this community, and through participation in this community, all of you can make our individual calls come alive. That is what a beloved community is. I believe part of my call as a minister is simply to remind you of your callings and to participate alongside you in building a more powerful, beloved community for us all, one that fosters our principles and our purposes. And conversely, it is your obligation to remind me of my call, particularly when I allow anger, frustration, or any of the other petty emotions to block my hearing a higher calling. We are all together in this thing I call life. The second individual I'll tell you about lived in the last century, and he was from my grandparents' generation. So I'm not talking about someone from the very distant past, only the immediate past. James Luther Adams was born in 1901, attended Harvard Divinity School, became a Unitarian minister, eventually earned a PhD in religion, and in 1956 became a Harvard Divinity School professor. He retired in 1966, had an active retirement, and died in 1994 at the ripe old age of 92. Early on, I mentioned we have a choice to act against our natures. Adams addresses this in an essay titled The Changing Reputation of Human Nature. And he said, we can use our freedom by expressing a will to mutuality, but we can also abuse it by exercising a will to power. Freedom and liberation is therefore both the basis of meaning and the occasion for the destruction of meaning. Here we see again the tragic nature of the human condition. The tragedy does not derive merely from the fact that humanity carries an inheritance from the jungle within. It derives also from the fact that we have a freedom that we did not have in the jungle. A freedom to exercise the infinitely higher powers of human nature in terms of creative love, and a freedom to waste them in mere lassitude and triviality, or even to pervert them for the sake of a will to power. I understand Adams's will to mutuality to be the same as my assertion of our mutual calling. And his will to power reminds me of the perverted calls of some ministers who seek power above truth. This manifests itself in current day ministers who condemn or deny women in the ministry, who condemn the gay and lesbian community, or those who have chosen paths other than what we deem as holy, such as acceptance of war or less than adequate medical care for one and all. But with regard to the concept of calling, Adams goes even further in his essay titled The Prophethood of All Believers. He says, the prophetic liberal church is the church in which persons think and work together to interpret the signs of the times in the light of their faith, to make explicit through discussion the epical thinking that the times demand. The prophetic liberal church is the church in which all members share the common responsibility to attempt to foresee the consequences of human behavior, both individual and institutional, with the intention of making history in place of merely being pushed around by it. Only through the prophetism of all believers can we together foresee doom and mend our common ways. Hope is a virtue, but only when it is accompanied by predictions and by daring ventures of new decision. Only where the prophethood of all believers creates epical thinking. I am also here to promote the prophetism of all believers, and that includes you, and it certainly is not limited to me. If we are to lend support in the repair of our communities, our country, and even our whole world, we will have to work together to make a difference and listen to that higher calling. The final individual I want to tell you about is undoubtedly the most famous of the three. He blazed similar trials to the other two only long before either of them was born. He too had a calling, went to Harvard Divinity School, and established a parish ministry. His promising ministry was cut short because he had a disagreement with the other ministers of the day. The disagreement was over serving Holy Communion. He couldn't bring himself to serve it, while the other Unitarian ministers continued to hold on to that tradition. He chose to blaze his own trail rather than being confined or limited by theirs. His calling was obviously very different and certainly no less valid than theirs, but it would not be from behind a pulpit anymore. Since that time, Ralph Waldo Emerson has become one of our most treasured Unitarian forefathers. He went on to make his living on the lecture circuit. Emerson made his split with his fellow Unitarian ministers in what is now known as the Divinity School Address. This address was to the graduating class of the Harvard Divinity School, and today that address is required reading for all prospective UU ministers. In the introduction to the copy I own, Conrad White says of the address, "The Divinity School Address remains a perennially fresh solvent for dogmatic orthodoxies, especially Unitarian orthodoxies." Personally, I believe I experience some current day UU dogmatic orthodoxies in the form of a belief in a mystical calling. So let's see what solvent Emerson can help me apply to my concern. He says, "These facts have always suggested to man the sublime creed, that the world is not the product of manifold power, but of one will, of one mind. And that one mind is everywhere active, in each ray of the star, in each wavelet of the pool. And whatever opposes that will is everywhere balked and baffled, because things are made so and not otherwise. Good is positive. Evil is merely privative, not absolute. It is like cold, which is the privation of heat. For all things proceed out of the same Spirit, which is differently named love, justice, temperance in its different applications. Just as the ocean receives different names on the several shores which it washes. All things proceed out of the same Spirit, and all things conspire with it. In my own personal point of view, we all proceed out of the same Spirit, only different in different ways. It's up to each of us to be inclusive or positive with our spirits, instead of exclusive and privative. I choose to be inclusive. In conclusion, I sincerely believe the fountain of all good is equally in us all. It is the higher calling we are all subject to. It is why we worship together, each of us learning from and inspired by the other. We are all together in this process we call life. We contribute a little or a lot to that effort. There are no requirements or expectations. Those who choose not to contribute at all simply choose to ignore the higher calling, but hopefully not forever. We can choose to protect the butterflies in this life or not. We can choose to be mutual and our affections, or exclusive and privative. We can choose to recognize the single spirit available to us all and everywhere active, or we can choose to ignore it. We can choose to share and protect our limited resources, or fight for them just like a hummingbird. Our concern with this life, with this world, with this country, with this UUA, with this church, with these our friends, with our families, with ourselves, is that we each listen for our own individual calls, wherever and whenever we might hear them, and to answer the calls in some small or some grand way, and make positive contributions to this existence, this life, the only one we share together. The goal is not perfection. The goal is participation. My hope is we will all take the time to simply listen to our individual calls. We are all called. Now please listen. Amen and namaste. Now please join me in our closing hymn, number 298, Wake Now My Senses.
Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in all. Keep with the web of creation your vow, giving, receiving as love shows us how. Wake now my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Wake now compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now my conscience, with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race. Wake now my vision of ministry clear. Brighten my pathway with radiant here. Mingle my calling with all who will share. Work toward a planet transformed by our care.
Now I get to extinguish our chalice. My benediction this morning is I am only one, and it was written by Everett Hale. I'm only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do.